Welcome. I've made a brief video about Baopuzi. Baopuzi is another name, a self-chosen name, of Ge, who also authored the biography of Lao Tzu. And in a very similar way to how he constructed the biography of Lao Tzu, that is, taking all of the different mentions of Lao Tzu and compiling them into one document, he did the same thing for methods and practices for longevity and immortality, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. He authored many different kinds of things, but we'll be taking a look specifically at this. He was also a very well-known Taoist practitioner, which meant a lot of things. It meant an expert in the ancient Taoist texts. It meant an expert in all the different bodily regimens that were thought to prolong life by harnessing the power of Tao. And it involves the use of talismans and herbs and different alchemical formulations, essentially to perform magic. And the idea is that if you performed all these different regimens and meditations, that you could achieve mystical and magical things, right? So he was a very well-known Taoist practitioner. Also, as the youngest son of a wealthy family from the South, he had a lot of advantages, but also a few disadvantages. Elder sons could inherit land. Elder sons could be promoted into the bureaucracy. But as the youngest son, typically youngest sons were conscripted into military service, and so he also made a big name for himself in military. And the reason I chose this background, he achieved the title General Who Makes the Waves Submit. So even though he was a Taoist practitioner, which is typically associated with peace, right? And even though he ascribed to a lot of Confucian precepts, he also had a very law-abiding, a very rules aren't made to be broken, a very what in ancient Chinese context we call legalist stance as well. He could squash a rebellion. And it's, typically we see paired together that even though he was a Taoist practitioner, he admitted to killing at least one man and at least two horses, right? With his martial prowess. He was an expert in both hand-to-hand combat and archery. So, framing this course as we have in terms of the Chinese roots of martial arts, Ge is a very important and very interesting case because he was a Taoist practitioner on one hand, but he was also what we would refer to now as, an experienced martial artist on the other. Later on, in more recent times, like in the past 3 centuries or so in China, these would become one and the same. But at this time, we never really see an indication, at least not in Ge writing, that he really saw them as particularly combined, his martial art on one hand and his Taoism on the other. But we can't then assume that they aren't connected at all, right? This man was an expert in each, so maybe there was some overlap. But it's an interesting case because it's the first time that we find both of these so close together, in the same person at least. Baopuzi translates to master who embraces simplicity. Again, this is a name that Ge gave himself and then also titled 2 enormous works. One is titled The Inner Chapters, and it's what we'll be focusing on in this brief lecture today, called the Nepian. And then there's the Weipian, the outer chapters, which were focused on more secular issues, all the problems, the real problems, the real life problems going on in all the various kingdoms, and what he thought would solve them. So again, the main theme that we'll be focusing on in the Nepian is what Ge had to say about extended life and immortality. You also read the Guanzi for this inner cultivation section this week. Both of these works were very pivotal in the development of Taoist religious practices, and you'll see that they actually have a lot in common. So basically, Gohong has chapters dedicated to most of these different things. Basically, there are things that you can do to extend your life. You can do good deeds. This was associated with a more bureaucratic, a more governmental stance, right? So we aren't just talking about Taoist hermits living in the mountains, although those did exist. We're talking about how people who have jobs, who have, city lives, can achieve extended life as well. And Gohong really thought that good deeds could help make one's case. There are also different breathing techniques, which were also mentioned in the Zhuangzi. You remember at the very beginning that the true man breathes all the way from his heels. Gohong sought to describe what this really meant. And the idea is once you have perfected your breathing to such a degree that you can circulate your qi effortlessly, then you can achieve what's called embryonic breathing or fetal breathing. Fetuses, embryos, don't breathe through their mouths. They don't breathe in or out. They don't use their lungs to breathe, and yet they still get the oxygen they need. Sort of like breathing without using one's lungs becomes the ultimate goal. The idea is the fetus has everything it needs. It doesn't need to take anything in from outside. Not the most perfect biological explanation, right? I'm aware, yes. Also different sorts of gymnastics, different sorts of exercises and stretches, what would become Qigong and Tai Chi Chuan, which we'll talk about later on, may have been given rise from what Gohong describes. There's also different potions, different elixirs that you can make. This is connected with fasting, which I've put at the end of my list here, but the idea is you make more and more concentrated foods from fewer and fewer sources, right? So if you start out a meditation regimen, if you start out, with the goal to extend your life, you'll start to pare away. You'll start to do away with different kinds of foods. You'll do away with the heaviest foods first, right? So this is typically referred to as the 5 grains, right? So first you'll cut out basically all the fiber, right? All the stuff that makes you heavy. And weigh, not like necessarily like gaining weight, but all the foods that are, heavy and require a lot of work from your insides. You'll move toward only vegetables, and then you'll move to only different herbs. Eventually you'll just be eating or drinking like tinctures, like really concentrate, like just 1 or 2 drops. And then the goal eventually is to not need any food at all. There's also a description of what I've translated, what's often translated as arts of the bedchamber, which the Guanzi talks about too. This is Jing, right? This is the idea that if you preserve all of your fluids, then eventually they'll achieve a purified state. Like qi becomes something different once it's purified. And so all these various fluids, if you keep them in, if you catch my drift, they can be used to nourish your own body. Essentially, to let fluids escape your body is wasting your own qi. Mentioned qi a few times. Qi, it's a tone 1 if you take Mandarin. So the goal, at the center of extended life, is perfecting the circulation of qi. And this is, a depiction of an ancient rendering of the character, very early rendering of the character. And typically we think that it is a bowl of rice. If you take Mandarin, you'll recognize that this is mi, right? This is rice. And the sort of the vapor that comes off the top of it, you see in those lines up top. The idea is there is something, we could say, in the air. There's something all around us that allows us that is the material for life, basically, that it enlivens things. It's the breath that allows things to live. It's also translated, as you can see, as vital energy, the thing that makes things move. So essentially, for anything to exist, I've got my window here, I'm looking at the cars drive by, there's a butterfly that flew by, all these different things. In order to be stuff in motion, the very motion itself, the energy that things need to move, the energy that moves things, all of this is qi. The power that penetrates the universe and makes it move is called qi. This is a quote from the Baopuzi, Napian inner chapters. As for those who excel at circulating their qi, internally they are able to nourish their body, externally they are able to repel illness. And this goes on, like not only to repel illness, but also cure other people of their illness. And also, if one's qi becomes circulated so well that it's as if it merges with Tao itself, merges with the qi that moves everything in the universe, you can become invisible. You can appear at different places at different times. You can fly. The idea is that the stuff that makes things move is all the same stuff. The stuff that you gather up to live a full life, right? When you're at your most energetic, when you're in your 20s and you're full of chi, and then your chi eventually, as you move closer to death, it slows down, it leaks out, it dissipates, all these different things. And that's the reason that things become still. It's the reason that things die, is because their chi doesn't circulate as well. So the idea for achieving extended life is to keep that momentum going and eventually to set it up like a gyre, right? Which is like a self-propelling motor, like the movement of chi just continues to propel the movement of chi. But all these ways, all the ways described in this list of moving one's chi, don't go far enough. Eventually, they can extend your life, but they can't give you immortality. All these different things merely accentuate your own chi, right? So the idea is you're given so much chi when you're born. Not everyone has the same amount, interestingly enough. We'll talk about this more when we discuss Ju Shi later on in the course. But taking what you have and trying to preserve it isn't enough to become immortal. To attain immortality, you must fill yourself up with something that never dissipates, right? So it's not just chi that you need, Gahong thought. It's something else. And he called it Xuan, right? You see the character here, translated by some as the mystery itself, right? But we can think of it just as we have with all of our different characters, like Wu, right? This emptiness, this vagueness, this indeterminate, this not yet being formed, right? This darkness. This is also referred to, there's a whole school of the mystery, and they are often referred to as the dark arts, right? There's this, so there's Tao, which penetrates all things, right? There's Qi, which is Tao in a complicated metaphysical arrangement, but this idea that Tao precedes everything, it's that from which all things rise, and Qi is how it moves, right? But there's also this idea of Xuan, that which remains primal. So if Tao is always emerging from the beginning, Xuan is that from which it emerges, right? So Xuan never dissipates, never goes away, never moves, right? So it's the ultimate darkness, as things. If we think about things coming into existence as things coming to the light, Xuan always remains dark. Gahong thought that if we can take this Xuan and transport it into our own bodies, right? If we can translate this ultimate darkness that never ever dissipates, that never energetically really exists, right? So because it doesn't begin to move, it's the unmoving center of things. It's that is the ultimate potential. If we can have this in our bodies in some way, then we can become just as unmoved, right? Just as immortal. Here's a quote about what Xuan is. Of course, it would be incredibly difficult to describe. It carries within it the embryo of unity. It forms and shapes yin-yang. It breathes in and transforms the myriad things. It makes the constellations go round. It shaped the primordial darkness. It exhales the four seasons. If one adds to it, it does not increase. And conversely, if one takes from it, it does not decrease. If we can just figure out how to make Xuan appear and remain inside of ourselves, then the idea is we would take on all these qualities. Gahong was convinced that the only way to preserve Xuan in ourselves was to eat alchemical substances. So if we take a look at this diagram, sorry that the quality is not great, we can see some of the renderings of how Gahong and Guanza in the early stages, and then it would be developed throughout the Taoist religious tradition, what interior bodily alchemy might look like, how we circulate our qi, where these different substances and these different properties reside in our bodies. In the very center, you can see it's a cauldron, right? So just behind the belly button, just by the curve, where the leg emerges from the hip. The idea is if we can come to ingest, and for Gahong, he meant really physically ingest. Later Taoist religion would metaphorically ingest. If we could ingest certain alchemical substances, they would be stored right there in our lower abdomen, and they would provide the power that we need to circulate our qi effortlessly forever. Gahong thought when you combine gold and cinnabar, which is the only ore form, the only rock form of mercury, that something magical happens. There's this transformation where you get an even stronger substance than both of these substances combined. Gahong thought that these two substances, which are incredibly difficult to destroy, even though gold is soft, it's difficult to destroy unless it's combined with cinnabar. If we ingest these two substances together, Gahong thought, then we could fill that cauldron with something that never goes away, with something that always remains just the same through time, like Xuan. Fortunately for Gahong, he was never able to find cinnabar and gold. And so while, he lamented not ever being able to achieve immortality, it probably saved him in the long run because these are incredibly toxic substances. He would later in life hear that there was a cinnabar, cinnabar was discovered in a mountain in what is now Vietnam. And so he attempted to go there and set up, his laboratory so he could begin to make the cinnabar elixir. But he never made it. By some accounts, he was convinced to stay. By other accounts, he was detained indefinitely. But he ended up spending the rest of his days at Mount Lofu, engaged in his immortality practices. He did, as you can see, eventually die.